年级的时候呢，会安排一个校内外的一个专题讲座的一个系列，对中国建筑史相关的一些专题呢，再进行一些深入的阐释。那么我们每年呢，其实都会邀请非常年轻的学者，通常是刚刚拿到博士学位的，刚刚在大学里面任教的国内外的青年学者，分享他们最新进的一个前沿的一个研究。那么我们今天的讲座呢，是以线上的形式进行的。我们请到的是去年刚刚入职凯迪夫大学建筑学院的谭磊博士，给我们分享他的一个跟博士论文的一个核心的研究内容。那么这门课程呢，所以希望我们线上的朋友们非常欢迎大家加入我们的这个讲座和讨论，但是希望大家在整个过程中呢，可以保持这个话筒的关闭啊，摄像头的关闭，维持我们大学的课堂的一个纪律。那么在谭博士的讲座结束之后呢，我们会开放问题给大家。那么首先是我们班级内部的同学们呢，先有一个提问的环节，然后呢，请我们线上的听众们呢，可以把问题打在留言框当中，我们后续呢会选择一些比较好的问题进行回复，好吗？那谢谢大家的参与。那我们的英文课程呢就正式开始了。Okay, so let's start. And today we are very happy to invite Dr. Tan Lei from Cardiff University to give us this guest lecture. And I have personally known Dr. Tan for about 10 years. And she actually has a very interdisciplinary educational background, including architecture, archaeology, urban planning, and heritage studies. And her PhD dissertation basically focused on the sustainable heritage management of Chinese timber structure, the early Middle Ages timber structure. So today she actually bring with us part of some case study from her dissertation and talking about dynamic framework of sustainable heritage management. And particularly, Dr. Tan will bring with us actually very hot debated case of Guangmiao in Shanxi province, which actually was renovated by a famous architect in 2016. So it is very important and interesting to review this renovation case from the perspective of heritage management. So I'm really looking forward to Dr. Tan's lecture. So let's give time to Dr. Tan. Yes, please start.
Hi. Oh, I can hear myself. Yingchen, you might want to mute. Yeah, thank you. That's it. 大家好，下午好，晚上好。Good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So as Yingchen has very kindly introduced me, I'm currently a lecturer in architecture history at the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University in the UK. Before joining Cardiff University, I practiced as a heritage conservation planner and sustainable heritage tourism consultant in China and Laos. I studied building archaeology at Peking University and conservation of monuments and sites at the Remolade International Center for Conservation in KU Leuven in Belgium. So that kind of explains the sort of interdisciplinary background that Yingchen has mentioned earlier. So today's lecture will introduce a relational and dynamic framework to reconceptualize sustainability and heritage. Essentially, I try to answer the question of what is sustainable heritage? How do we define it? And how can we facilitate it? And why do we need it? But to begin with, it is really important that we unlearn some of the things that we've always been taught. I'd like us to assume a position where heritage activities are not necessarily sustainable, and heritage activities do not necessarily contribute to the world's sustainability. It doesn't mean that they can't be those things, but it is just important that we question those assumptions. So to answer these questions, the research sets out as an interdisciplinary interrogation of heritage and sustainability. It investigates how these two concepts may be understood under a coherent theoretical framework, how they are debated in academic and public discourse, and how they are practiced in complex contexts, such as management of heritage sites with early timber buildings in China. One of the research objectives is to bridge the gap between theoretical reflections and practice in the heritage field. This initiative emerges in response to the disconnections between the recent critical turn of heritage studies and heritage practices. One of these disconnections lies in the challenges of translating the academic critiques and critical approaches into applicable methods to inform heritage practices, policies, strategies, and decision-making. So my research concerns a reconceptualization of heritage and sustainability through theoretical exploration and empirical studies to develop research and practical methods to tackle these disconnections. Another initiative comes from the ubiquity of these two concepts, heritage and sustainability. We're hearing these concepts everywhere. And their connection, they both have a connection with a sense of crisis. So it seems like we're in a crisis. We need to rescue, or the heritage sites are in crisis, so we need to rescue them, or our world is in a crisis, so we need sustainability to tackle these crises. So the focus on China's heritage management partly comes from my passion and my previous professional experience in building archaeology and heritage conservation and management in China. More importantly, it is a deliberate choice to achieve another objective of this research, to establish a critical account of the complexity of China's heritage practices, which are things that I'm sure most people in the audience would know a lot about. But if you read Anglophone literature written in English, or academic research and critiques here, sometimes it's quite simplified. So I really want to introduce that complexity into the research and scholarship. So the empirical studies are selected to present these complexities with grounded data to challenge a perceived notion of the Eastern approach. So there's this idea of something that is called the Eastern approach, but actually is a lot more complex than that. So where it all began, my initiative for this research can be traced back to 2013 when I was working on the conservation management plan of this particular temple. This is Baiyu Gong Temple in Jiaodi village in Shanxi province, which is also one of the 3 case studies in this broader research, although I won't be talking about this today. During my work on this project and all the subsequent years following what has happened to this place, I have reflected on the broader definition of heritage, what it is and what it does, the work that we do as heritage professionals, what it means for the place, its communities, and broader society, and how such efforts can be more sustainable and meaningful. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory. I know it can be a little bit difficult to understand or abstract, but I hope it will make sense when I started talking about the cases. But just to explain very simply, when we're thinking about heritage management, or if we are thinking about sustainable development, there are so many priorities that we need to think about. Right, we need to think about how we preserve the historic built environment, how we preserve our natural environment, our ecosystem, but also how we sustain the economy, how we sustain the coherence of our community, how we sustain the other intangible cultural practices, or how we make sure that everyone has a fair chance to get their education and other opportunities. So there are a lot of priorities for anyone working in these fields to deal with. So sometimes it can be really, really hard for us to be able to capture all of these at the same time. Sometimes we feel like we can only deal with one or two, but we have to let the others go. But it is really important that we need to be able to tackle all of these challenges at the same time. So this theoretical framework is the idea to understand all of these priorities and the actors and associations as assemblage, as a network. So if we pick up all these things within a net, we can then pick up a lot of these priorities together without dropping some of them. So obviously within this net, this assemblage, sometimes disruptions can happen. So the connections between these actors can break, and that can cause, if there's like a severe disruption, it can cause the network to break down. It can become obsolete. On the other hand, there are also other opportunities when these things break down, and they can form a new association, a new assemblage to also reach a sustainable state. So for example, which we will explain with the case study, if there's an adaptive reuse project of a heritage site, let's say the heritage site's original function is no longer there. So some of these connections between the previous users and the heritage site may have disappeared. So the network might have broken down, but if a good adaptive reuse project can make sure that all these actors can come together and form a more sustainable mechanism and assemblage, then this can be a new assemblage, which can be a very positive thing. So it's about being open to change within the system, but also understand how this new assemblage can be sustained. So these are just what I just already talked about. Like there are different ways of looking at how we can sustain a system, sustain assemblage, or we can create situations where new associations can be created, new assemblage can be extended or expanded. So this is the complicated theory bit. So I won't talk more about it, but hopefully with the case study, this will become a bit clearer. So obviously, I won't ask you to feed back to the class, but if you're just sitting there with a notebook, I would just ask when you are listening to the case study, perhaps write down some of the actors, some of the main actors involved. Think about how they're associated with each other. So these actors are usually tangible actors, but they don't have to be people. But obviously, people are important parts of that. But they can also be historic buildings, they can be the natural environment, they can be the trees in the temple, for example. So they can be non-human actors too. And in terms of associations, that usually means a kind of relationships between them. That can be on an individual level, people's memories, people's personal association with the place. It can also be collective, a community's connection with the place, things like that. So if you just note it down, and if you have any question, we'll have time to discuss. Okay, so now that our first story, heritage rescued, I have a question mark there, so we'll look at this case. But before that, I'll just give a really, really brief context, because I'm sure actually probably everyone in the audience would know this. But just to provide a bit more context, the cultural heritage industry in China has experienced an unprecedented boom in the recent decades. Besides the need of national identity building by demonstrating the richness of Chinese culture, the development of the industry is made possible not only due to the resources brought by the economic development of the country since the opening up in 1978, but also partly due to the feeling of threat associated with the heritage sites lost to that process. This feeling of threat is one of the main characteristics of the concept of heritage in the post-cultural revolution era of China. It has given rise to heavy investment on heritage from the state and a lot of attention to heritage from the public. Oops, there we are. The case study concerns a significant region in China, as most of you would know, regarding early timber building. So that's the south and southeast part of Shanxi province. It holds the highest concentration of pre-14th century timber buildings in China, which makes up for about 50% of all the surviving ones in the country. Most of the surviving structures are religious or memorial places, although historic building conservation had not emerged as a concept in the pre-modern period. These places of worship usually have a higher hierarchy in architecture form and a higher priority in social life, which rendered them more likely to be maintained. They are also very often located in remote areas, which avoided them from demolition due to urban development. The discovery of some of the country's oldest surviving timber structures in this region has played a significant role in the establishment of China's heritage conservation and management system. It was the only reason why state-led efforts and resources would be poured into this region to rescue these tiny rural temples. This was also the context in which I encountered this region in my previous practice. The research started upon the completion of a decade-long national scheme, the Southern Project, 南部工程, which is the most widespread and heavily invested scheme regarding the restoration of historic timber buildings in the country at the time. It symbolizes a significant national investment of resources into cultural heritage. This specific space and time mark the reference point where the empirical case studies are situated. All of the selected cases have gone through restorations during the Nanbu Gongcheng. The interventions or the non-interventions that happened afterwards were also very much related to the context of this project. This premise makes it more feasible to discuss the management and sustainable futures of these sites. I call them sites here, but really what I try to look at is what constitute the heritage assemblages in these cases and how they have evolved. So now we look at specifically this case study of Guangren Wang Temple. So as most of you would know, this is located in Zhonglongquan village in Ruicheng County in Yuncheng municipality in Shanxi. The temple is situated on an earth mound northeast of the village, about 7 kilometers north of the town of Ruicheng. Guangren Wang Miao was designated a national protected cultural heritage site in 2001. There are only 2 historic buildings left on the temple ground. The surviving stage was constructed in Qing Dynasty, while the main hall is believed to have retained a Tang Dynasty timber structure. On the lower ground in front of the temple was a pond, which is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, right in front of the temple there. That has been dry for decades, but the shape is still visible. So after it was somehow rediscovered by architectural historians in 1958, a restoration was carried out in the same year. It has never been assessed how much percentage of the structure has been altered during this restoration. The portion of materials from Tang Dynasty is a kind of question whose answer no one seems to be willing to find out. Nevertheless, the belief that this temple is of outstanding significance because it has one of the few surviving Tang Dynasty structures in the country is very persistent. It should be emphasized here that the Tang structure's materiality is essential to the representational heritagization process on a national level, meaning it wouldn't have been a national heritage site if it wasn't for this building. But what is quite interesting is that this material authenticity seems to become a little bit less important after it became a protected heritage site. So there's a bit of a make-believe mentality, and this mentality is strengthened during the 2016 makeover project. So before I go into details with this the analysis of this project, I'm aware that this project is highly controversial and it has ignited a lot of debates within, with among the public. So I'm here presenting my analysis of it. So obviously, not everyone might agree with what I'm going to say, but I'm very open to discussing this if anyone has any question or points they want to make. So if we look at what has happened after the restoration, so this building was restored. The main historic buildings were restored from 2013 to 2015 under Nanbu Gongcheng. So after this was completed in 2015, Wanke, as we all know, a large real estate company, announced to the public that a crowdsourcing heritage project called the Long Plan, Long Xihua, had been set up to facilitate the environment improvement of the site. So this plan included the fund sourcing and implementation of the project that transformed this little local temple into a heritage museum. So after this project, a small public square was created in front of, as you can see here in blue, number 1, in front of the entrance of the temple, which was redesigned. And the new entrance takes visitors through a winding ascent, sort of a winding staircase in number 4 here, yellow. It goes towards the entrance to the ticket office. And along this entry access, the temple's main hall, which you can see you can see it in 2011 before this project, but in 2018 after the project, when you're going towards the building, you can't see the main hall anymore. So this is blocked from the visitors' sites. This way of approach is in contrast with the previous entrances, as I said. So that led the visitors to the main temple ground. The previous entrance led the visitors to the main temple ground via a slope. The visitors are then led to an enclosed introduction space, which you can see here on the bottom left. A full-scale section of the main hall is engraved on the ground, and then they're directed to exit the introduction space and turn into a narrow ascending corridor. The walls that are flanking both sides of the corridor block out the other area of the temple, as you can see here on top right. Basically, it creates a kind of framed image of the side facade of the main hall. Except for a few openings, the museum space is separated from the main temple ground by walls. The circulation is guided along the edge of the site rather than, as you can see here, from number 6, you're going into 7, and then you're encouraged to go back to number 8, and then through number 9, 10, 11, 12, and then back to the main temple ground. So this is along the edge of the ground rather than towards the center of it, where the historic buildings are located. So the action of Wanke was characterized by most media reports as an act of philanthropy because there's a lack of funding. They also tend to characterize the initiative as something that stems from the spontaneous enthusiasm of the individuals involved instead of a corporate action. However, the situation of Guangren Wangmiao is far from the most devastating among the sites under the Nanbu Gongcheng. It is equally reasonable to believe that Wanke chose this site because the site has a Tang Dynasty structure. The heated debate started when the project was completed, and the result of this project was reviewed in May 2016 online. So I have chased a lot of debates and a lot of published articles of various actors, including people online, people offline, discussion offline. I've chased a lot of these voices, and I've identified 5 controversies under this complex web of opinions. So the first one is the authenticity of the historic setting. This is one of the most debated issues. The leading architect Wang Hui claims that the project did not intervene with the historic material evidence, the historic setting of the site, because there's no material evidence remaining. Some heritage professionals support this idea, since there is a lack of tangible traces left of the so-called historic setting. It is reasonable and respectful to history to create, so they believe that it is reasonable and respectful to history to create something modern instead of reconstructing a so-called historic setting out of imagination. Other people suggest that the project has not been sensitive towards the broader physical setting, the rural village and the surroundings. On the other hand, the spatial relationship between the main hall and the stage, where people perform for the spirits, symbolizes the relationship between human spirits and the place. So as you can see here, during any sort of temple fairs, there will be a traditional opera performance on the stage, which is not just for people, actually mainly for the deities inside the main hall, so that spatial connection is really central. So despite the architect's claim that the design enhanced the authenticity of the intangible setting by returning kinship and folklore culture to the everyday life of the villagers, the choice to exclude any folk culture in the exhibition and the decision to ignore this very relatable spatial association between the main hall and the stage brings this claim into question. Another central issue related to that is the various identities of the site. So this is considered to be now both a space of worship and a place of knowledge. So the former refers to its historic function as a temple built for a local population to worship a local deity. The latter refers to the function that came with its heritagization, which recognizes its value as a testimony of Chinese architectural history. The architect admits that the reason for choosing the theme of architectural history over the rain-praying folk culture is mainly because of their team's limited specialism. Those who support the latter identity build their arguments based on the premise that the previous temple was no longer a religious venue. But other people noted that this presumption is false. Before the project, the temple was still a space of worship, even though it might not seem popular daily. The monthly pattern of worship on the 1st and the 15th day of the lunar month, it fits into the rhythm of the everyday in rural villages. So they criticized that the architects tried to reinvent a connection between the heritage site and the community instead of respecting and enhancing what has already existed and is still existing on site. Another major issue relates to the specific design and curation of the museum. And various actors, a lot of people consider that the architectural language of the museum resembles an urban square or an urban park rather than a small village temple. Some also comment on the restricted museum circulation and abstraction presentation of the main hall. As I mentioned before, visitors are guided around the temple rather than guided towards the main temple ground. And also, as you can see, this is a kind of almost like an architectural elevation way of presenting the building. And you also have some of the architectural drawings as a main kind of exhibition items in the museum. So behind all of this quite orchestrated architectural language, there's an explicit intention, which is mentioned by the architects and also most people who were decision makers within this project. There was an intention to create a museum as a kind of educational space to the community and to the general public. But when a project is intended to educate the local community members and the general public, the opinions of those who are to be educated are somehow left out of the decision-making process. So according to one of the project's initiators from Huanke, the project was set out to, quote, return the temple to the village and to introduce the temple back into the everyday life of the villagers and to encourage the villagers to care for the temple. So a reputable so there's also a heritage expert team who had supported the development of this project, and they have argued that one of the most crucial contributions of this heritage project is the participation of various sectors of society. And this is speaking to a long-standing issue within China's heritage practices, where heritage professionals have been advocating for broader participation of our society into our heritage practices, heritage activities. So not just professionals, not just public sectors, but also, private businesses and general public. So there's some comments straight after the project where people saying that it's really moving to see how the villagers were enjoying the site. But based on the observation and interviews a few years after that, the increase of frequency of the villagers' visit to the temple or the museum is very limited. There's also an observation by a visitor in 2019, which provides a really vivid account and insights into the reasons behind, as you can see here in some of these quotes. So as mentioned before, one of the most fundamental aspects of the issue lies in the lack of community involvement in the decision-making process during the project. According to some of the interviews during this research, the community members, including the caretakers on site, they were not consulted during the formation of the project or the design, but they were only they were able to sort of voice their opinions only when the construction started. So although the initiators and the architects claim that the project has harnessed significant benefits for the local community, evidence indicates a lack of impact on the economy of the local community and the villagers' willingness to visit the museum. So the initiator characterizes also the project as transforming dead heritage into living heritage. However, 2 years after the completion of the project, when this research was conducted, the impact of that revitalization has become a bit questionable. There's no doubt that the physical environment of the temple was improved. As you can see here, this used to be kind of surrounded by a kind of informal landfill, and there's no safeguarding in terms of the temple. It's very easy to breach into the temple, and as a lot of you would know, there was a theft in 2012. And so there's no doubt that this project has improved the physical environment of the temple significantly, including providing a public square where villagers can go and hang out. But what's interesting is the kind of management mechanism that has been agreed upon. So the idea was that the agreement between Wanke and the local authorities is that while Wanke was responsible for financing and implementing the project, it is not taking on the responsibility of running the museum, which was then given back to Ruicheng County to manage the museum. From what can be seen on the site, such a model does not guarantee the continuous innovation and maintenance of the museum, for example, including update of the exhibition or maintenance of the exhibition. So as soon as the project was completed, this management model almost went back to almost exactly the same as it was previously. So the project has also created a museum space which requires a lot more effort to maintain, so let alone to update and renew the exhibition. So even though the community members are very proud of the temple, if you ask them, but it seems like there's the exhibition is only telling one story about this temple, which is mainly related to the architectural history and the value related to that. But it doesn't necessarily excite very long-lasting interest in the local community's everyday life. It's if you remember one of the quotes from the previous slide saying that they feel like they don't understand what this is being said in the exhibition, and they don't really know why that is relatable to them. So there's a lack of sustainable interactions with the community. This further undermines the goal to keep the site alive. So I've just talked a lot about a lot of details in terms of these controversies that I could see by chasing a lot of these opinions. So again, I won't ask you the feedback, but feel free to type anything into the chat. But basically, I would like to just for us to stop a little bit and just have a think about what kind of actors have you noticed throughout this project, and also what kind of associations we can spot. So, for example, there are some very notable actors, including Wanke, obviously, the architecture firm, the local authority, the heritage professionals involved, but also, obviously the local community, the caretakers. But as well, I would like you to pay attention to some of the non-human actors, such as the buildings themselves, the temple ground, including also the natural environment around it, or the village environment around it. So how were all these associations formed over history, and how has this project had an impact on them? So just to give you a taste of what I had done in terms of thinking about these questions. So after chasing a lot of these opinions through a timeline, I try and then identify, as I said, some of these actors, and I try to look at how they relate to some of these other types of actors, but also some of what kind of main issues come out of their opinions or their involvement of this project. And then in that sense, to then identify what were the controversies that I just talked about. And then I chased some of these relationships. Sorry about all of these acronyms, don't worry about it. But basically, I label a lot of these associations. So some of these associations come from the temple as a religious site from the very beginning. And it was created to pray for rain, because there was a drought season in the 9th century in the area. But some of these associations come from after the buildings were recognized as a heritage site. So there's a heritage association related to that. There's also an association related to a school period, which was basically during the Cultural Revolution period, when the temple was used as a school. So this is very common, as a lot of you would know. It's very common within the area, but also across the country. And there are a lot of community members who are of that age, would have some memories, will have the association and emotional connection with these places, not for its being a temple, but for it being maybe their primary school. So this is not as apparent in this case study, but it's very obvious in some of the other cases that I looked at. So I followed the change evolution of these associations, but also to identify some of the main reasons, the main factors influencing these changes. So what are the kind of main factors? For example, it could be the Cultural Revolution is one of a very important period, but the ideological movement at the time is a very main factor. But when it comes to the heritage association, the heritagization process, like the listing of it becoming a national heritage site, is also a very important factor. So I looked into all these causes of why these changes happen. I then also chased how these associations change over time. So what is apparent here in this case is that by the time when this project was finished, this transformation project was finished, the Heritage Association as well as the Museum Association is really front and center within this heritage assemblage, whereas the Religious Association kind of takes a back seat. And because the lack of mention of this religious connotation, or the association between the local community and the temple, that association has not been strengthened. It actually has been weakened because of this project. And that kind of reduced the possibility for the community to come together and think, this temple is ours, what can we do about it? It's not to say that it can't happen, but it just reduces the possibility of that. So the reason for doing this is so that we can anticipate change after a certain project or a certain period. If we want to think about what would be the sustainable future for this site, this assemblage, in a sense that we're not looking just at the historic buildings, but we're looking at all of these different things, different entities related to this site. If we want to create a more sustainable future, how can we ensure that all these different associations can cohabit and they can coexist and reinforce each other? So, Yingchen, I don't know whether it is a good chance now to have some questions for this case study before we move on to the next part of the lecture.
I would suggest to make the Q&A at the end of the lecture.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, just let me have a drink. Yeah. Okay, so if you have any questions, just note them down or send them in the chat, and we'll discuss that later. So that was a very controversial case, and there were a lot of opinions that I had to grapple with. And obviously, it's still very debatable what was the impact of that project. But now I want us to perhaps look at another project, which is actually more cheerful, and it's quite a positive case, but it's really unique within among all of the cases that I investigated. So throughout this project, throughout this research, I went to nearly 70 sites and across this region. Not every one of them, I went to as many as I could. But this is almost the only case that presented this relatively positive image in terms of the temple's sustainable development. So yeah, as I said, so this story is quite a contrasting one compared to the last one. So this is a very unique case where local initiative and effort was seen as proactively engaging with the site's future. So this case is chosen for its rarity rather than a representativeness of this whole region. So the temple is called Longwang Miao, Longwang Temple, in Dongyi village in Lucheng in Changzhi municipality. So the temple is situated in the northeast corner of the village, as you can see here on the bottom right. It's a slightly distance from the historic residential area. So based on building archaeology studies of the area, this main hall is then dated as a Jin Dynasty structure. And it was also designated a national heritage site. So the temple complex was used as a village primary school during the 1950s to the 60s, and then subsequently a middle school until 2004. So quite a while, even after the Cultural Revolutions finished, it was still a school until quite a bit later. So it was designated a provincial heritage site in 1986, and then in 2006 a national heritage sites. So as I mentioned here, the temple is located here, just north of the historic residential area of the village. Within the village, there are still a few historic sites left, besides the historic residences, the courtyard houses, but there are also a few pretty important social spaces. So for example, the one in orange here, there's a village square. It's new, but it's a village square that is used a lot by the community. They can do whatever, sometimes temporary markets, sometimes events and festivals and stuff. So it's really a main central social space within this village. And then we've got a community service center down here, which also has a small yard. And then another primary school just over here. There's also a schoolyard, which is also an empty kind of semi-public square. So these are a pretty important social space within this village. And then the other ones are the kind of historic monuments, if you will, left within the village. There's a few temples here and a shrine, and also there's a village gate here, which is topped with a temple on top of it. So the restoration project under Nanbu Gongcheng of Longwang Temple was carried out in 2013. So traces of the school could still be seen from photos before the restoration. So there were slogans, there were also school buildings that were left from the time. So there are currently 2 courtyards in the compound. It is not a registered religious space now, but obviously the name suggests that it was a Taoist temple historically. And religious activities are still happening in the temple, which is very common, as we all know, across this region. So the 2 side halls of the second courtyard are now installed with exhibitions. The one on the west side is a relatively new exhibition about agriculture, which is over here. About agriculture and about everyday life of this village and the region. So it's one of the very, very few places where the local community tries to use the space actively. So it was this new exhibition, this tiny little community museum that caught my attention in the first place. So based on the information gathered during my interviews, the exhibition was initiated by the management unit of the local district. So it was a local commune management unit, which is also the property owner of the temple. So it's a collective ownership that owns this temple. But also a few representatives of the villages, some villagers who were quite influential, who became local officials within Lucheng city. So the exhibition is quite small, and the planning of it at the time when I went there, it was phased out over quite a few years. There were 3 different phases where they wanted to make different themes of this exhibition. That's mainly because of the limited funding and resources that they've got. So they sort of phased this out. But it shows a really valuable example of how local effort can still pull together different resources from various sectors to make things happen. The exhibition also involves the community by encouraging villagers to donate their old tools or household objects to the exhibition. The small museum is obviously not the main attraction for visitors who came to visit the temple. A lot of people, outside of the local area wouldn't even know this existed. They would have come here to see the Jing Dynasty main hall, really. But it is a really remarkable effort to use the heritage site, to use the temple to tell the story of the local community and to give more meaning to the site than just being an old timber building. The village holds one of the biggest festivals in the region. So it's the Long Title Festival in the spring. So I was able to sort of follow all 3 days of this festival. So this festival is celebrated throughout the country. There are a lot of Long Title festivals everywhere, but this one is quite well known in the region. According to the villagers, the celebration of this festival has never paused, even during the Cultural Revolution in 1960s and 70s. But it was in fact since the restoration of the Longwang Temple in 2013 under Nanbu Gongcheng that the local community felt that now we've got a really nice place, so let's revitalize the festival even more. The festival is also a very significant occasion to showcase the intangible heritage of the village and the region. So 2 of them were very prominent and were observed during the festival in 2018. So one is called Kangzhuang, the other one is called Yuehu. Kangzhuang is the one below here, and Yuehu is the one above. So these 2 entries of intangible heritage are demonstrations of how living traditions can be passed on to the next generation, but in very different ways. Kangzhuang is mainly practiced in Dongyi village, but also in that region as well. But Yuehu is practiced by a certain community, and they were invited to come to the festival. So they would be going to different festivals across the Shandong region. So Yuehu is a used to be at least a somewhat exclusive tradition, which is only practiced within one community. They are responsible for the music that is played during the rituals, which is one of the 3 essential elements of the Saishe culture in the Shandong region. The inheritor of the 6th generation, who is also a national intangible heritage inheritor, 非物质文化遗产传承人. So he is the 6th generation of the family. He learned his skills and inherited his instruments from his father, and has been passing his knowledge and skills to his son and grandson. The inheritors take pride in the fact that Yuehu has been registered as a provincial intangible heritage expression. The composition of the community has also become more inclusive. The Yuehu performance is, as I said, it used to be practiced only within this family, but now people from outside of the communities can also join and learn the performance. So Kangzhuang, on the other hand, is quite intrinsically intergenerational. So what happened is it involves the participation of an older and a younger generation. Young children of the village are carried by adults on a very long pole during the parade. So these are real children on top of the poles. They are very securely strapped onto the chair, so it looks a little bit dangerous, but it's relatively safe, I would say. And obviously they're all dressed up, and it's a really big occasion. The purpose for doing this, doing Kangzhuang, is to basically pray for the good health and fortune for the children. So families in the village, they all volunteer to do this for their kids every year. And the young children, they're not always enjoying the experience, because usually, because it happens in the spring, it's usually very cold, and at least the time when I was there, the weather was a bit miserable, so some of the children were crying. It was quite a long day being strapped onto a pole, so sometimes they were crying. They were not always enjoying it, but it's definitely very memorable. Like, they will remember this for their childhood for sure. So as I said, I was able to follow the whole festival and documented the activities throughout. So the main space where the rituals, so there were rituals, and then there were also like festival social activities happening. The main rituals would be happening within the temple. The day always starts and ends at the temple with these rituals. So they happen in Longwang Temple, and they would have a parade that goes all the way to the village square. They will circle around the village square. They'll basically invite the Dragon King out of the temple, bring it to the village square, have a parade, have some performance, have some music, and then bring it back to the temple. The first day also is called inviting the Dragon King. So they take the Longwang out to the field. They take the chair out to the field to invite the Longwang to come to the temple, to come to the village. And then the last day is called sending off the Dragon King. And then again, they have the parade as a way to sort of send off the Longwang, thank him for bringing rain and prosperity to the village. So this map kind of shows how this intangible heritage is making links with the tangible space. What's quite interesting is the kind of so with Yuehu, because it's very linked, very associated with the ritual, with the religious practice. So this music is usually played within the temple ground, where the rituals and the praying and any activities related to the Dragon King were happening. Whereas Kangzhuang is more a kind of secular activities and more like a festivals. So the parade of the Kangzhuang usually it doesn't start at the temple. It starts at the village square. It doesn't go into the temple, but it actually goes around the village, as you can see, sort of going, threading through all this important social space within the village. So you can already see, even in terms of the activities and how they interact with the tangible space, there's a separation between religious and perhaps slightly more secular and social kind of activities. Traditional operas were being played at the primary school ground as a stage, so they used the stage there, and a lot of villagers would, after attending the temple, praying at the dragon, to the Dragon King, and then they will come and enjoy some performance at the primary school stage. So besides being the physical space for the living traditions to take place, the Longwang Temple is also a social space during the festival. A lot of villagers who live in other towns or cities come back to the village to join the festival. Visitors from the region also, from broader region also come to Dongyi. There were like over 10,000 people within one day in a festival in a tiny village like that. Volunteers of the village come to the temple to help out with fire watching and other logistics, and all kinds of social interactions can be observed in the temple. There were also traveling priests come from all kinds of other regions, and they would come because there's a festival. They would come and do their rituals here. There were also obviously people praying, and then people kind of chanting as a way of answering the prayers of the villagers. People obviously also have a look at the history of the temple. So that here they are looking at some of one of the newer tablets, stone steles documenting a restoration. There were also, so this is not the Yuehu music band, the one here on the bottom left. They're actually a local music band. So they will be playing the music actually for the non-ritual part of the festival. But when it comes to the ritual part of the festival, then the Yuehu crew will play the music. So as I said, it has also come to my attention that many of these people remember the temple as their school, where they spent a few years of their childhood, and that memory, even though after the restoration is not really present in the physical space, is still very much alive and vivid among that generation. There was a teacher who was in his 90s, who also still came back to this temple, even though he wasn't necessarily from this village. So the festival also becomes an occasion where schoolmates and the teachers can get together. Some of them have kept closely in touch for decades since their time as students in Longwang Temple. So as I said, this is not an exclusive situation in this temple. It's quite common in many sites that I have visited in this region. So this layer of history is not one to be forgotten, and is actually quite prominent among the generation who still has a close relationship with the temples. And I was told many times during my research, during interviews, that if these buildings were not used as the schools or sometimes other functions like storage space for grains, etc., these buildings would not have survived. So this layer of history is not usually considered to be the original history of the heritage site, during which it was used as a temple usually. But I would agree that this layer of history is very crucial to restore or to sustain and to enhance the connection between the people and the heritage, and should certainly be given more attention. So I won't go into this in detail. I did more or less the same. I traced these associations, and I look at what sustained them, what caused changes, and how they interact with each other. So what we can see here in this particular case is that a lot of these associations, they were grassroots. So for example, the community museum that was initiated and sustained with local effort. There's no very prominent external actors. Obviously, because of that, potentially they have less money, they have less resources, so they have to do things slowly. But in a sense, because of these activities, the community has a lot of sense of ownership and sense of belonging to not just the temple as a heritage site, but all with a very old building. But it's also a museum, a space where their community, their everyday life and their own individual history is embodied. So yeah, so this is also just a prompt questions for discussion. It's just, I think it's really important to think about how this, what kind of factors have contributed to this temple's current, at least at the time when I was there, this looks to be a very promising situation where the local communities have some ownership and have some agency to manage the site. Obviously, still keeping it safe and keeping it, according to all the legislation and regulation for national heritage sites. Keeping the very old building safe. That's one of the reasons why some of these volunteers were there at the festival very diligently, kind of taking out the incense and making sure that there's no fire hazard to the building. But in the meantime, utilizing some of these buildings within the temple, the side halls that were not, they're not really functioning, and they're using that to initiate a museum that the community feels close to. So this is really compared to the last case, it's a very contrast, is a big contrast between the two cases. Both somehow have some museum elements in there, but one is initiated by really strong external actors with a lot of resources, with the ability to invite, a very famous architecture studio, with support from nationally renowned heritage professionals, whereas there's another one which is looks a bit more lively and vibrant at the time, and it was more sustained by initiative from the local community. So that's it. Thank you very much. I've talked a lot, so now I'm really happy to discuss and answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for Dr. Tan's lecture. Yes. Oh, great.
Do you want me to?
Yeah. I will take a photo for you in the classroom later. And first of all, I would like to give maybe a short summary of this lecture, and maybe give more background knowledge to our international students, because actually they may be not familiar with both cases. It is not the same as our Chinese students. And actually, I think that today, at the very beginning, Dr. Tan gave us quite a complicated framework for heritage studies, and this one might be a little bit difficult for our undergraduate students majored in architecture, but it doesn't matter. But I think that Dr. Tan actually provided with two very, very interesting cases of heritage renovation or regeneration, because actually you noticed that both buildings actually are temple, and they are both dragon temple. And the first temple, we sometimes call it a 5 dragons temple. And the second temple is dragon temple, Long Wang Miao. The first one is Wu Long Miao, both related to dragon. So it is related to water. The water is actually very important to all the traditional human settlements in all of the world, right? So you can imagine that how it is important to the residents in the pre-modern times. But actually that in the 20th century, the significance of the two temples actually are quite different, because the first temple, the 5 dragon temple of Wu Miao, actually it was identified as one of the 4 Tang Dynasty temples in the history of Chinese architecture. And this temple was written in the textbook of 中国建筑史, Chinese architectural history. And every student in year 1, they need to remember the name, and because we will have text 考试 examination, we will have to write down the name of this temple. So it is really, really important because it is supposed to be Tang. And the second temple, actually, it is related to Jin dynasty. Although it is also very early, but actually we have dozens of timber structures from Jin, so that is not really important. Actually, most of us don't really know this temple. We just know that in the southeast part of Shanxi, there is quite a lot of Jin dynasty temples, that's all, but not particularly every single names are important. So basically, in the history of Chinese architecture, the significance of the two temples actually are very, very different. And the second thing I want to explain is the difference of the actors in the renovation and the restoration process. And we can find out that the Five Dragon Temple, maybe because of it is so important, particularly from the architectural history viewpoints, that actually the local government may invited Vanke. I don't know if you know Vanke. Vanke, which is a very large and important real estate company in China. And so Vanke invited a very, very famous architect, Wang Hui, from Beijing. So basically all the client and the designer, they all from outside. They don't really belong to this community, but they are very high level, are very, very important. But for the second case, I don't know, you mentioned the client or the designer who actually participated in it?
Yeah, I'll explain that just because of time. I didn't go into the details. So, so what happened was, supposedly, according to all of the reporting and what the initiators in Wanke has said, so Wanke initially approached Ruicheng County and Shanxi Province. They wanted to participate in the restoration rather than the environmental improvement project. So they want to actually help fund the restoration of the historic buildings. But that was rejected by the State Administration of Cultural Heritage because at the time, they think this is not a good idea. And then Wanke approached the local authority and the provincial government again in 2013 after the restoration. 2015 after the restoration, and again saying that now they wanted to be involved in the environmental improvement project. So that project, the transformation of the museum doesn't touch the historic building, so they're not allowed to do anything to the historic building. So it's really important that we separate that. But also, like the local government then, because of various reasons, think, okay, this is okay, and so that was approved, and so then they were able to invite urbanist Wang Hui and the team to come and do the project.
For the further information. So this is actually the very different actors in the renovation and the restoration of the two temples. Actually, they are quite different. And then we can think about its relationship with the local community after the renovation. And we can find out that the first project was completed in like 2016, right? 15 or 16, and actually it rises, it becomes, the architect introduced this project all over the country, and this project was introduced in the highest level architectural journal, 建筑学报, and there are a lot of critical and review articles related to this project. So actually, for the first project, I think that it actually arose the very hot debate and attention of the architectural professional community. But of course, there is also the local community and other people, the public opinions, a lot of things. But for the second project, I have to say that maybe it is not really well known in the professional circle, like published in the journals or in the medias, maybe not so much, but we can find out that actually it is very well used by the local community. So we can find out that the two dragon temples, actually they become quite different after this renovation. So actually heritage management, we can find out that it is kind of an intervention in the very long history of the building, and whatever you do, it will cause some influences on this site permanently. So this is why that after the project was completed in 10 years or something, we need to look back to it and take critical reflections on it. So this is, I think, a part of the management process. So this is my project. This is my, not really a summary, but just provide you with some additional information and some of my personal understanding of the lecture. And Dr. Tan actually provided some questions or maybe discussions to you guys. Anything that you want to say, want to respond? I open this microphone so that it may be. Say something. Do you have any comments for the two projects?
I like the fact that she mentioned the traditions that she put in.
So which project do you prefer?
I like more the it has more management.
The parade, the second.
Yeah.
Okay, so you like the second. Fernando, yeah, he preferred for the temple with the parade, the second. 小宁, Oh, you have a question. Wait, would you like to come here? And yes. 南老师，您说中文可以，您说英文对。您能听到我说话吗？
都可以啊。
可以啊，好吧，都可以 both. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the very informative lecture. And in terms of the interaction of the sustainable heritage with the community, and like it said in the point, like one of the goals is to build a community museum. And my question is how to decide and who should decide what kind of story should be told. And when sometimes there's too many stories to be told, then what's the standard of not including some of the stories, and what's the standard of the so-called utilization? Yeah. And this is my first question. And the second question is a bit in general. Like besides the fact that there's a lot of factors to be considered, what's the biggest and most common challenge in the process of the sustainable heritage management?
Yes. And give us one comment, which one you prefer?
I prefer
the second one.
Okay. Thank you. Should I answer the questions?
Sure. Yes, very good
Yeah.
question. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I will answer the questions in English because they were asked in English. And also I'm aware that not everyone maybe understands Chinese, perhaps. The first question, both questions are really important, but the first question is actually a very good question. And I have to say the answer shouldn't be a standard answer. So that's my answer to that question. Like, who should decide on the stories, what stories to be told? That should be decided collectively. And I think different actors needs to be consulted in a way. and I don't, and obviously there's, as you can see in, in some of these projects, not just the first one, but in a lot of cases, there are competing stories, as you say, but I don't necessarily see them as competing. They can exist in the same place. Within the second case, the history of the building is also displayed in one way or another. There is enough space, if there's enough will and there's enough resources and knowledge, then we can tell these different stories. And I think these heritage sites, they're not just temples, obviously. As I say, like there are so many different layers of history, and these buildings being, some of the oldest timber buildings in China surviving, that's a very important layer of the history and the story as well. So I don't think it should be one or the other. They should be told, all together, and they should be told by people who care for these stories, and it's just the idea that people who have these stories, people who have these connections, they should be given a voice. So that's what happened in the second case, whereas in the first case, because there's really strong external actors who decided not to include any sort of local customs or religious connotation, then that story is not being told. So I don't think there's one answer to all the cases, because in some cases, the local community is not even there, like it's really in the middle of nowhere. So there's a different situation. So it needs to be case by case. But it's the ideas that, the idea of using this relational framework in understanding heritage is that we're not just asking, let's say, one group of people to decide what are the values of these heritage sites, but we're asking different people who have connection with these heritage sites, and we look at all these connections together, and then we can decide, okay, who have connections to these sites, and who can then have a voice and to tell the story. So they don't have to be always on the site. It can be offline as well. So there are different digital means and media that can do that. But yeah, so like I said, that should be a case by case answer. The other one, the biggest challenges, I think this is one of those biggest challenges, is to have a management mechanism where these voices will be given a choice, will be given a voice, like they will be given a chance to speak. And I think in our, there's a lot more awareness now within China, at least for community and public participation, but still it is really difficult to kind of change the decision-making process, to make sure that these voices can be heard, even if some of these voices might not be always the same as the kind of value assessment of the heritage sites, but they should be given a choice, given a chance to speak. That's the idea. But that is a very big challenge, because obviously when you have limited time, when you have limited resources, like for example, when a heritage professional institution is doing, let's say, making a heritage conservation plan and management plan, they have time constraint, they have resources constraint, they have human resources constraint. They can't always do this very extensive research into this, but the idea is that we should be aware of that, and we should try our best to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. 回答了 OK 好，谢谢小印，小印每次都会提很好的问题。Jonas, you are online, and if you have any question, please just input in our chat box. And 我们线上的听众啊，如果有问题想和谭博士交流的话，我们也可以在聊天室里面打字啊，打问题。那么我们可以用中文交流，因为线上的听众应该大多数是说中文的，我们可以用中文来交流。好的，那个我还有一个 I have one more questions actually related to the two very beautiful chats you have showed us, the last two ones. And actually it looks a little bit complicated, but I just curious, like how how this kind of chat actually help us to understand the association of the heritage-related community. Could you please just maybe explain a little bit more of the two chats? Like if we compare the first the chats of the Wulong Miao with the chats of the Longwang Miao, how they are different with each other. 我this 就是那最后2张表格啊，它用何种方式可以帮助我们理解就是那个遗产的这种连接，社区的连接度和这个参与。
好，我等一下我 share。
对，我们再 share 一下。然后我们线上的听众可以在这些时间里就可以打问题啊，如果有的话。Jonas, if you have any question, please input in the box.
Okay, so
yeah, the last two ones and compared with the two cases, how they are different with each other, because it looks like a little bit complicated to
yeah. No, I understand. So first of all, I have to say, like, these were the diagrams that I developed during my PhD. But since then, I have actually, I'm continuing to develop the system, because for me, it's really important that they are applicable to heritage practice, that I can explain these to practitioners, professionals who are working in the field. So, I have to say, like, they might not be the kind of final products that I would present, but in a way to answer this is, first of all, this is not quantitative, meaning that I don't have say this is increased by 2 or this is increased by 1. It's not quantitative like that, but it is just to understand the trend and the change of some of these associations. So, for example, here, as you can see, with, let's say, if we look at the one,
我们好像看不到这个你的屏幕最后一张，对，可以。
现在看到吗？现在看到吗？
好像没有诶。
哦，等一下，
可以，可能要重新。
我再重新 share 一下。Is the religious connotation. So what I've done here basically is just to demonstrate the trend of change of this association. So, for example, when it gets to around the time of the Cultural Revolution, when it became a school, this religious connotation is obviously diminished, but it's not entirely none. So it's not disappeared, because of the evidence that I got from my interview is that religious activities were actually still somehow happening, but more on an individual level. And it hasn't really necessarily changed much until one thing that happened, quite an important thing that happened is, even after the Cultural Revolution, it was still used as a school rather than being, converted back to a temple until 2004. Another thing that was really important that happens is 2013, when Nanbu Gongcheng restored the temple, which make the physical environment a lot better. So then again, this is coming from the evidence that I got from communities, not just my own imagination. So they were, quite clearly telling me that, the reason why they would revitalize the festival was partly because of the restoration. So in a sense, Nanbu Gongcheng had a very positive impact on the community being able to revitalize these religious festivals. So that's why, these things would increase, and as far as we've observed at the time that this festival is going and it's going strong, it's getting sustained. So you can see that there's a trend that this association is increasing, but also in a sense, because of that community museum, there's a new association, which is in the red here, that is related to the, sorry, that's not right, that one. But so the one related to the museum is also being increased. And then you also have association related to the heritage destination, which is also being increased because of the restoration and things like that. So in a way, a lot of these associations, you're realizing they're working together, so they're not like competing against each other, as the last question was asking. So they were actually working together, they were reinforcing each other. They're making it more likely that the community will maintain the temple as well, so that again have a positive impact on its heritage association. It has an impact on the museum association. So if we compare this to the last one. So this one, some of these associations are very similar in terms of religious and, the kind of dip in during Cultural Revolution. But if we're thinking about the latest impact of the project, what the project did was definitely reinforced a lot of that heritage connotation in terms of its architectural significance. So some of these kind of knowledge-based, let's say, associations were really reinforced after the project. It also obviously created new association with the museum and also, association with the private sector, with Wanke, the real estate company, and also with the general public. But what we're seeing in terms of the trend of change is that after this project, one is the religious connotation and this connection with the local community, they are being diminished. So they're actually being weakened, and there's no prospect for that to be revived, or there's no, at least at the time, there was no initiative to revive any of these or to enlarge any of these. And because the museum is now, purely about architectural history, then, the community wouldn't think that they could use some of the space of this temple. The local festival is still happening in a sense, so it's not completely out, but it just feels like there is at least from the interviews that I'm gathering, the data is that there's a distance between that and the temple, and it doesn't feel as inviting. But also, if let's say the museum association is so dominant within this association, it just means it's kind of stifle the possibility of all the other associations. But then because of the management mechanism, the museum's maintenance is in question. So how would this museum be in 10 years' time if there's no one to update the exhibition, there's no one to sort of, regularly sort of doing activities with the museum or inviting other people to come and visit the museum? What would happen then with this museum? It's unclear. So that's where, if we look at the trend of the development, it feels, not feels, but it appears to be less sustainable at the time. So, but this needs to be observed over time. As you said earlier, we should see it, over 5 years, over 10 years. What is this trend? It's not to say that, at some point or another, or even now, perhaps the community decided that they can come together and do something with the museum or with the temple, and so that can happen. It's just less likely. That's it. Sorry. Stop.
Yes,
That's
very
right.
clear. Okay. How about another one? the other chart, I mean, the very complicated diagram, X-mind diagram.
Oh, sorry, which one?
The one before this chart.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just curious.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, this one. Okay, so this one is really just about chasing the change and the emergence of these connotations or of these associations. So, for example, I look at let's take which one? Let me see. So let's have a look at again. We'll take the religious one as the main example. So we can see this one in which is MS1. So all of the MS1, 1, 2, 3, 4, they're all related to this temple being a religious temple. And so then I look at how they changes. So all of this kind of subsequent sort of changes. I kind of chase all these different events in its history. You know, for example, even with the maintenance over over several centuries, and we have stone stelae telling us at some point this has been restored. In 1958 this has been restored. In Qing Dynasty this has been restored by whom? And so I trace all this change in terms of how this building has been maintained, but also obviously at some point the religious association is interrupted by the Cultural Revolution and socialist transformation at the time. So at that point, even though there were a lot of changes before that point, the religious association is somehow maintained. So even though it's changed, but it's still being maintained. But at some point, because of that interruption, the association is disrupted. So I'm just basically chasing all these changes without, looking at the trend of how it has been changed, and then I identify what are the factors causing this change, right? As I say, in terms of maintenance of the temple over history, the community's economic resources are really important as well. So they need to have the money, they need to have the the materials to maintain the temple. But obviously right now that is different. You have different actors, different factors. The funding source is different. Where the materials coming from is different, and the technical and professional knowledge where that comes from is also different. So I'm chasing all these different factors. The idea is that then thinking about a sustainable future of the site is to think, okay, what is the condition for these associations to be sustained? And how can we facilitate that? So, for example, if we think that sustaining the connection between the community and the temple is really important for this, then we need to make sure that that happens. So we need to create opportunity for that to happen. We need to perhaps encourage that kind of connections to be encouraged, to be revived, and to be created anew. So it's the idea that if we understand what causes all this change, then we can think about what we can do in the future.
Okay. It seems that time is up, and it seems that we don't get any questions from our online audience. Let me check. No. Okay. So that's it. And thank you very much again for today's lecture. It is really, really inspiring and interesting. I think that both to me and to our students, and let's thank Dr. Tan again for this very interesting lecture. Okay. 谢谢
Thank you for the opportunity.
非常有意思，非常感谢。好的，辛苦了，我们时间到了，我们那个下课时间正好是8:35，所以 perfect。好的，谢谢你，谢谢，好，拜拜，拜拜，
拜拜，拜拜，
再见。